Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Farmers Market Fun. My name is Megan and I'm a museum educator here at the Kamloops Museum and Archives. And just before we get started with our activity today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are located on Kamloops Secwepemc territory within the traditional and unceded lands of the Secwepemc Nation. Now today we are going to be baking bread. I'm so excited about this one. I've been baking my own bread for as long as I can remember since my university days, and I'm really excited to share this recipe with you because bread is really easy to bake. It's hard to mess it up, and it's really, really tasty. And I think it's also a really important historic dish that has been baked for a long time through history, and it especially offers us a bit of a window into women's lives in the past, which I think is something that's really interesting and worth exploring in this series. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We are going to be making our bread today in a Ziploc bag. The idea behind this, of course, is that if you're working with a large group of kids, you can make it in a Ziploc bag, and then your hands don't get dirty. You don't need to dirty a bowl while you're doing it. So feel free to give this a try at home, or feel free to use a bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to add in my yeast first. So I've got these little packets of yeast. For this recipe, you are going to want to use quick rise yeast. So they're available in these little packets at the store. I know some people have been having a really hard time getting yeast due to all of the COVID bakers. But do try. Some stores are starting to have more of it in stock. So we're going to start by adding this little guy into our plastic bag. So one of these packets equals out to about a tablespoon of yeast, maybe a little bit more, but one packet of yeast is what I would use for a loaf of bread. All right, so get the yeast in there. Now, very important, something that some people don't know is that yeast is actually an active, a living thing. It's a living organism, so you need to feed it. And for that reason, we're going to put in a teaspoonful of sugar. So yeast, of course, likes nice, sweet things. You can use sugar, you can use honey, anything that's going to give it a little bit to eat. And if you were working with traditional yeast, of course, you would be putting this into a bowl with some warm water and some sugar, and you would be leaving it in there for about 10 minutes to let it start to activate. And it's really neat to watch traditional yeast activate. It starts to bubble up to the surface and move around in the bowl. But because we're using the quick rise yeast, we're good to go. We're going to go ahead and we're going to add in our water. There we go. So 3/4 of a cup of warm water, and we're going to start adding in our flour. So we're going to add in 1.5 cups of flour. Now, one of the reasons that I really like this recipe is that it's not an exact recipe. You might need to add a little bit more flour. You might need to add a little bit more water. So we'll just see where we end up. So 1/2 a cup of flour. 1 cup of flour and 1.5 cups of flour. All right, and the last thing we're going to add in before we start mixing is a pinch of salt. So I'm going to just pour in a pinch of salt. Oops, you're looking for about 1/2 teaspoon here. So I'm going to put a little bit back. About 1/2 teaspoon, and that's just to give your bread some flavor. All right, and then we're gonna seal up this Ziploc bag, and we're gonna start mixing that flour in. So as you can see, as anyone who's ever made bread will already know, bread dough can get pretty messy. We're gonna make it in the bag so that it hopefully will not get quite as messy. I'm gonna open mine up in the corner here though, just so that I'm not pressing down on air. All right, you can see I'm starting to get sort of a doughy texture. This is good. I think I'm probably going to need to add a little bit more flour to mine. So now we're going to get into what's called kneading. And when you knead bread dough, generally you'll fold it in on itself and press down. It's a little tricky to do this in the bag, so basically you're just wanting to mush it up. You're helping the yeast to activate, and this is what's going to make your bread delicious and fluffy and tasty to eat. It's interesting because the bread recipe I'm using today, with a few modifications, was actually passed down to me by my grandmother, by my Omi. And she'll tell stories about her mom bringing yeast home from the bakery, and it would come in little cubes that were extremely delicate, and you had to be very, very careful not to break or drop them. So very, very different from going to the store and just grabbing a piece of quick rise yeast, a little packet from the grocery store today. And of course, we're going to make this bread. We're going to need it probably for less time, but generally you want to aim for about 10 minutes, give or take. But for women who are baking this bread for their families, I mean, they would be making multiple loaves in a week. Oftentimes families wouldn't have had, at least in her time, they wouldn't have had an oven indoors. They would have a brick oven outside that they would be baking this in. And the mom of the house would be responsible for making this bread every week, all year round. So you can imagine what that would have been like, and even just the time it would have taken. I know we've talked in some of the other videos we've made just about the sheer amount of time that cleaning and prepping vegetables from the garden takes, cleaning and preparing meals and getting things ready, especially when it comes to meat and things like that. So I think this gives you a really interesting window into what the lives of women in the past would have been like, and how their lives would have been different from our own today, even if we do make our own bread by hand or by bread maker, as it were. So you can see my bread dough started to get a pretty good texture. Probably if I were to take this out of the bag right now, it would be not quite sticky anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Put my hands in here. So as we keep kneading, you're going to want to make sure you're blending all that flour in. You don't want any wet spots in your bread. And this is about the texture of mine, so about the texture of bread dough now. Starting to look pretty good. Now, when you go to bake this, it's going to be 375. It's probably going to need half an hour in the oven, maybe a little bit more. What we're making here is actually a half loaf of bread. So if you're going to be trying to make a full loaf of bread, you'll want to double the recipe. So 3 cups of flour, 1.5 cups of warm water, a tablespoon of yeast, and some sugar, a little bit of salt. You can also add some oil and some lemon juice into your bread. If you read the back of your flour bag, you'll probably learn about the lemon juice secret, which is supposed to make your bread nice and light and fluffy. I've also heard people say you can use the water from boiling potatoes, and that will make really delicious bread as well. So we're going to just keep kneading away here and get our bread ready to go into the oven. You do, of course, want to preheat your oven. And if you don't have a bread pan at home, do not worry. You can always take this dough and you can just plop it onto a cookie sheet. If you put it in one big nice round ball, kind of like this, you'll end up with a nice round loaf of bread. You'll be good to go. The other options you have, you can make this into buns. You can also make this into bagels or pretzels. Bagels and pretzels differ from bread. You take a pot of water and drop each bagel or pretzel into the water, boiling water, for 30 seconds before you bake them. And that's what gives bagels and pretzels their chewy on the outside and light and fluffy on the inside kind of texture. So feel free to try all sorts of experiments. This also makes great pizza dough. Cinnamon buns, if you want to make some cinnamon buns, add a little bit more sugar to your dough and then put sweet on the inside of your bread dough. So bread dough is really versatile. It's good for many, many different things. So once your bread is totally finished being kneaded, you're probably going to want to do about 10 minutes, a little bit more time than we've done here today. You're going to set it aside and let it rise. It should rise for, again, 10 to 20 minutes. What you want to do is place it somewhere warm. I usually put mine on the oven as it's preheating. Just place a dish towel over it so that, you know, no flies or bugs or anything get into it. And then you're going to want to pop it into that oven, 375, probably about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more. And you will have a beautiful loaf of bread. So thank you so much for joining me, and next time we will be making freezer jam. So you'll need some berries, some freezer jam pectin, some sugar, and I think that's everything. Some water maybe, and a mason jar. So we'll see you next time for freezer jam. Thank you so much for joining me.